Hi guys, today I'm going to read chapter 24, but I want to review where we are in the story. So I made this picture. Let me try and turn the camera around. Hold on. Okay, so here's where we are. Nell and Aunt Kitty are headed to Atkinson, Mississippi. Aunt Kitty is being Mrs. R.C. Potter, who's in ill health, pretending she's in ill health. And Nell is Penelope Potter. They're also going down with Detective Webster and Mr. Pinkerton. The case is a bank teller was murdered by a hammer with 3 blows to the head and $130,000 was stolen. The suspect is the bank teller's best friend, Mr. Drysdale. And we ended with them at a dinner party at the Drysdale's home because they're high society people. All right. So today's chapter is chapter 24, and it's called In Which Aunt Kitty Takes a Fall and I Rise to My Vocabulary Lessons. I'm trying the camera facing me thing today, but we'll see how that goes. I might get over it pretty quickly. How did we come to own such beautiful gowns? I didn't see you stitching this orange one at the boarding house. Aunt Kitty was brushing dust off her sleeves as we let our horses walk along the lane outside Atkinson. It was a sunny day just a week or so after our arrival. Mr. Bangs made yours, she explained. He asked me about your favorite color weeks ago, and as you noticed, I sewed mine myself. I imagine sweet Mr. Bangs tending to things back in Chicago, while Mr. Pinkerton was steel-eyed and sharp. Mr. Bangs was like butter. That's an interesting simile. Mr. Pinkerton was steel-eyed and sharp, and Mr. Bangs was like butter. Think about what's butter. Maybe smooth, creamy. Interesting simile to compare somebody to butter. We should visit a photography studio while we're here, I said eagerly. For the sake of Mr. Bangs, don't you think he'd be happy to see how good we look in our costumes, Aunt Kitty? Mind yourself, Penelope, she snapped. Oh, because she said Aunt Kitty. I rolled my eyes. Must she always be such a stickler for staying in character? The only living souls to overhear us on this back road were our horses and perhaps the occasional hoot owl. A photograph is an extravagance. We've no need for it. Don't be so old-fashioned, Aunt. Wouldn't you love to have an image to put in a frame, something to be remembered by? I sat for a camera once in my life. My Matthew carried the image with him everywhere, so we'd never be apart. I believe it was still in his pocket the day he died. I never saw it again. There was no sadness in her voice, just the flatness that honesty sometimes demands. I wanted to trot after her and ask her whatever happened to the picture, but I didn't dare. Aunt Kitty was too private for that. I urged my horse on and caught up with her, tasting a little grit in my teeth from the dusty road. So, how are we going to crack this case? I asked, eager to start a new subject. Aunt Kitty said she was asking herself the same thing. That sly Detective Webster has befriended Mr. Drysdale, she said, but we've got to get closer. We've got to gain Mrs. Drysdale's trust. We should visit for tea or call on her for another dinner party, I plotted. No, even closer somehow. We've got to see the Drysdales' comings and goings. We've got to try to get into Mr. Drysdale's head. How are you going to get into someone's head? I suggested we camp out in the woods behind the Drysdale house, though it was with some hesitation. I was fond of those silky sheets back at the hotel, not to mention the fancy food. I wasn't sure I could leave them for a bedroll in the woods and squirrel for supper. That's about as close as we can get to the Drysdales. Aunt Kitty studied her licorice tin, opening it slowly and popping a candy in her mouth. And for the first time since I'd come to live with her, she held the tin open to me and offered to share. That's new. I popped a piece right in my mouth, too surprised to even utter a thank you. It was dreadful. The bitterness was so sharp, I might as well have been sucking on a lump of coal. I felt my eyes water and knew with certainty that my teeth would be black for an hour. Licorice was just another thing that my aunt and I would never see eye to eye on. If this is anything like the case of Flora and Mrs. Maroney, I began, moving my tongue around in my mouth and trying to clear the licorice taste away, we're going to need evidence. Along like this. Or perhaps an eyewitness. Or both, Aunt Kitty said softly, as if her mind were 100 miles away. Unless the killer himself confesses. What are the chances of that? After a few minutes, she closed the licorice tin with a snap that made our horse's ears twitch. And she announced she had a plan that would get us as close to the Drysdales as possible. I was to go along with her no matter what might present itself. Aunt Kitty asked me to trust her and ask no questions. I wasn't confident that I couldn't do either. I wasn't confident I could do either. Trust her? When she thought of her sending me off to an orphanage, still nod at my head and ask no questions? Now, how was I supposed to do that? It's time we head into town, she said with a glance at a nearby tree. I could tell she was measuring up its shadow. Oh, that's so cool. To determine the approximate hour. So back then, didn't have watches and cell phones to tell time. So she is looking at the shadow on the tree to figure out what time of day it is. But I didn't need a short shadow to tell me it was lunchtime. My stomach's growls were making it pretty clear. We're to meet the ladies for a ride, Penelope. She took off cantering back towards the center of town, where the society belles were gathering for an afternoon outing. I trotted along behind her, eager to get a glimpse of a picnic basket that promised fried chicken and buttered biscuits. But unfortunately, I saw no such thing. Before long, we joined the party of frilly dressed matrons and a few white-haired gentlemen as they climbed into their saddles. Are the boots uncomfortable and... let's see. I have to figure out who's talking, sorry. Are the boots uncomfortable in the heat, Miss Penelope? One of them was asking me, her forehead crinkled up like a dumpling, like a roll, as she tried to appear sympathetic. An affliction of the foot must be hard on a young girl. Oh, yeah, because remember she said she's got something wrong with her feet, and then she has to wear those really ugly boots that don't match her fancy dress. They're remarkably comfortable, ma'am, I asserted, trying not to take offense at her clear disdain for my favored footwear. I forced a grin and let my mare trot on ahead. We picked up a storm of dust as we galloped along another lane into the country. I was deep in thought. My mind was like a pendulum on a grandfather clock, swinging back and forth between vivid thoughts of a fried chicken lunch and the holy head of the hammered bank teller. When a scream yanked me back to the here and now. I looked up and saw Aunt Kitty racing ahead of the rest of us, her horse bolting out of control like it had been bitten by a snake. Aunt! I shouted, mindful that I'd best not revert to calling her Aunt Kitty and reveal her true identity. Aunt, come back! By the time the rest of us caught up with Aunt Kitty, she was lying in the road looking limp as a rag doll. My heart was in my throat as I hurled myself off my mount and raced to her side. I'd seen enough of my family pass from this world. I couldn't bear another loss. Are you all right, Aunt? I gasped, pulling her head into my lap and brushing the dirt from her hair. My hands were trembling as they touched her face. Her cheeks were hot and a deep pink. Let Mrs. Drysdale do this, she hissed through clenched teeth, opening one fierce eye to stare up at me. Make room for her. I figured it out. Did you guys figure it out? Immediately, I knew Aunt Kitty was fine, and this was all part of the scheme. I fought the urge to throw my arms around her neck and hug her for joy. Instead, I scooched aside as Mrs. Drysdale rushed in to help. Oh, good heavens, Mrs. Potter, she said urgently, clumsily adjusting my aunt's head and placing it on her full skirts. You're alive. I thought for sure that horse had broken your neck. My aunt mumbled something indecipherable and made her eyelids flutter groggily. The effect was convincing, and Mrs. Drysdale called to the others for help. We just happened to be in front of my property, she announced. We'll take Mrs. Potter into my home to recover. By the looks of it, she'll need plenty of bed rest before she'll be herself again. And that was how we moved in the bedroom, next door to a murder suspect. Da-da-da-da. Did I read the title of this chapter? I kind of already forgot if I did. It was called In Which Aunt Kitty Takes a Fall. So we've definitely done the Aunt Kitty taking a fall part. And it was a make-believe fall, also that they could get into the Drysdale's house for her to recover. I wanted to stop, but the story was getting too exciting. And you guys know I haven't read this ahead of time. But there were some really good similes in there. I really liked the one about the grandfather clock, the pendulum swinging back and forth as her thoughts were kind of going from side to side. And then it said how her horse bolted as if it had been bitten by a snake. So to really show that the horse took off running. Another one that I noticed that I liked too was she was lying on the road looking limp as a rag doll. So a rag doll is kind of like a soft doll. So if you kind of like were to just toss it on the ground, it would just kind of be like, okay. So that's how Aunt Kitty made herself look. She did an awesome job. Okay, back to it. I'm only about halfway through this chapter, so I might have to do a part 1 and part 2 on this video because I don't know if my phone will be able to upload everything. Here we go. I will sleep with the fireplace poker in my hands, I was telling Aunt Kitty as I plopped down on the lumpy feather bed, the heavy iron bar across my lap. If I hear anything out of the ordinary tonight, I will start swinging. And as for you, I added, my eyes on her yellow hat box, I assume you brought your Colt? One cannot be too cautious when sleeping so close to a homicidal hammerer. So a fire poker, you guys, that's the thing that you would like use to kind of stoke the fire and keep it going. It's kind of like a long piece of metal that you poke into the fire. Aunt Kitty sighed and lifted that eyebrow of hers. She was not one to tolerate theatrics. But this was no comedy playing out upstairs at the Drysdale house. We were residing just 10 paces from someone who was quite possibly a villain of the foulest kind. We had to be alert, aware of our surroundings, and above all else, armed. But try as I might to convince my aunt of this, she seemed to think I was being dramatic. Surely by now you know that your strongest weapon is right here, she said, tapping her temple. Beside, there are 2 of us and 1 of him, Penelope, she added, tugging a hairpin from her bun. I believe that you can do that arithmetic. Fancy word for math. She could dismiss my preparations if she wanted, but I likened our arrangement to the night I had to fight off a pushy raccoon back on the farm. Whiskey was at my side, but that raccoon didn't give a hoot about being outnumbered. The only thing to make him hightail it out of our barn was the sound of my pitchfork swooshing past his ear. Sometimes a girl has to take a stand, I explained in a serious whisper, and while I'm all for using my smarts, I feel a good bit more comfortable knowing I've got something to back it up, preferably made of iron. Suddenly, a bump in the room next door made us both freeze. It was Mr. Drysdale moving about. Was he planning to pay us a visit? I clutched the fireplace poker and raised it to my shoulder. Aunt Kitty gestured for me to sit down, but I wasn't about to pay her any mind. We stood there in the yellow light of the single oil lamp, our ears listening for even the faintest noise. In my mind's eye, I tried to imagine Mr. Drysdale and his friend, the hammered bank teller, in better days. I pictured them laughing over a joke or sitting down to enjoy a root beer. They were best friends, just like me and Gemma. What kind of person would bring harm to his best friend? I mumbled to myself. Was it really possible Mr. Drysdale would do such a thing?